So, you've got a synthesizer. The question now is, what are you actually supposed to do with this thing? Or maybe you're thinking of getting a synthesizer and you really want to get one, but you want to think long and hard about which one to get and how it'll actually fit into your music production process. That's what I want to answer today, including having some commentary on some of the recent synth announcements and why I'm either interested or not interested in them using this framework. Way number one to use a hardware synthesizer is as a part of a bigger hardware setup in some sort of hardware jam. So you're probably going to have kind of a table full of gear, and you're going to be sequencing and or launching stuff live, potentially kind of jamming a full song out somewhat on the fly, maybe in front of an audience or maybe in front of a camera, or maybe just for your own enjoyment. Regardless, you've got multiple devices working together and you need stuff to generate sound. So maybe you've got a groove box as the brain and it's got some of its own built-in synths, and then you're expanding your sound palette with other hardware synths. That's a great way to use hardware synths. That's one of the major ways I personally use them on this channel, and the way a lot of the community uses them in the kind of synth nerd space. So some things that you want to watch out for are MIDI connectivity. You want to make sure that you've got the connections that you actually need to adequately sequence that synth. You might want to make sure that you have the number of voices that you need, because it's going to be kind of exposed in its most bare bones form. It's not going to be able to be like expanded in post necessarily later on, because it's part of a bigger setup. You're probably just recording the stereo out. So what you hear is what you get. And that's going to have kind of a big impact on what you get, because maybe you get something with a few more voices, or you write parts that are designed for fewer voices. For instance, I have my Roland JU-06A, which sounds lovely. It's a recreation of some of the most classic synth sounds of the 80s, but it doesn't even have as many voices as the original. I've been able to work within those constraints, and so for me, that's fine. That is a perfectly manageable limitation, but some people will find that to be an automatic deal breaker if they're trying to do hardware jamming. Also, you might want to keep size in mind. For me, I'm working in a fairly small space. Like, my room is now fairly open in the way that it's arranged, but still, I'm on like an IKEA table. Basically, I don't have a ton of space for a large hardware setup, and so for me, small synths are good for hardware jamming, because that means I can have more devices in the same amount of space. Built-in effects might also play a role. If you want to have reverb or delay or EQ or something like that, having it built into the synth can be really nice, because it reduces the number of devices you need for your jam. Or maybe if you have a groove box that can add effects like Innovation Circuit Tracks or MPC-1, maybe you don't need built-in effects on a synth, but it's definitely something to consider. All that being said, here's an example of a hardware jamming setup that I've used with the Innovation Circuit Tracks as my central brain, controlling 2 dedicated hardware synths, so that I have 4 synth tracks total to work with, plus the internal drum tracks of the Innovation Circuit as well. The second way to use a hardware synth is to multi-track it into your DAW. So basically, you have maybe just one synth, and you sit down, plug it into your audio interface, and start recording. And you record a bunch of tracks, layer a bunch of tracks of the same synth, or maybe a few different synths that you swap out, and you build your song up that way. You do arranging in your DAW, you add more elements in your DAW, and you go from there. This is probably the most common for new synth users, and it can be incredibly powerful and can let you get around limitations of a hardware synth. Maybe you could even use a groove box to sequence those synths, but still record the multi-tracks. That way everything is like perfectly quantized. Or maybe you use the synth's built-in sequencer. Regardless, here are a few things to watch out for that. For one thing, the main draw of this is the fact that you can work hands-on. Because if you want to get great sound into your DAW and great like sound design capabilities or recreations or emulations of classic hardware, you don't need hardware, because a lot of software can do the exact same stuff as a lot of the hardware digital synths that are out there. So the main advantage that the hardware digital synths will have is simply that the sound design process and the playing stuff process is hands-on, and you're kind of locked into whatever you just recorded, and you can't really change it much later. You can process it, but you can't necessarily tweak the actual synth sound itself, which can be an actually really nice way to work. You kind of commit to stuff on the fly. It's a certain flavor of limitations cause creativity, and then you're forced to kind of process stuff after the fact. That's a fun way to work. Personally, I don't do it that much, but I do very much enjoy it when I do it. You also might want to go out of your way to get an analog synth, because even though analog emulations sound pretty damn good and are fairly indistinguishable, at least to the average listener, it can be nice to know, hey, I'm recording an actual analog synth into my DAW. And then you multi-track that a bunch, and even if it's got limited voices, you can build up this big, lush, warm sound. In theory, anyway. That can be nice. Like, here's an example of me doing that with the Korg Minilog. And like I mentioned, it can bring much more limited synths to life and make them sound a lot more expensive than they are via layering. Here's an example of me doing that with the Korg Volca keys. Before we move on to our third way to use hardware synths, let me bring up something very important. And this is actually the thing that convinced me to take this from a video idea on my ideas list to a full video. When I personally am looking to buy a hardware synth, I want it to fulfill at least two of these ways of using it. If it only fulfills one, I will probably not end up getting it. I want it to fulfill at least two, and I do recommend you do the same to make sure you're getting good value for your money and the amount of space that a hardware device will end up taking up. For example, let's talk about the Roland JU06A, which I've mentioned earlier. It's the Juno recreation, versus the recently announced / released J6, also by Roland. It's got a lot of similar sounds, it's got its cool chord engine, and it would be a great addition to a hardware jamming setup. It's compact, it's got a bunch of neat features, and it sounds nice. So that did get me kind of thinking, maybe I try this out for the channel. It would be a great hardware jamming piece. But it doesn't fulfill any of the other functions for me. Like, according to the people who have reviewed it, it's basically just a hugely glorified preset machine, so I'm probably not going to be using it to design sounds from scratch, really. So that means it doesn't check the box of multi-tracking into your DAW. I'm probably better off just using software or the JU06A I already have. Or it doesn't check the next box, which is doing sound design hands-on and then multi-sampling it for later use. Devices like the MPC-1, Akai Force, as of recently, the Machine, and then stuff like the Black Box can do multi-sampling, where they can automatically sample multiple notes of a synthesizer and then map them to your keyboard. So it creates a pretty convincing recreation on that device of your synth patch. This is great because if you make a really nice synth patch, but say want to have more voices or just want to preserve it or even share it to other users who might not own that synth, you can do that. So this is something I really love doing with my hardware synths, and it's probably actually my favorite thing to do with hardware synths other than hardware jamming. So once again, having an emulator hardware synth can be nice for this because you get the feeling of working with a classic synth, but at a much lower price and probably a smaller scale. and you're all hands-on and moving dials and knobs and sliders and feeling out the sound design process hands-on, very tactile, and then you multi-sample that into, say, your MPC-1, and then have all the benefits of basically a software synthesizer, because you've got all the unlimited voices and endless processing power that you have on a DAW-like device, or in an actual DAW. Or sometimes I'll even just sample one singular note of a synth and then set about shaping it into something unrecognizable. Regardless, the principle is the same. The key for this is a synth that is fun to design sounds on. That's pretty much the main thing, and that it sounds good in a mix. Those are the two giant requirements for a synth to go into this category for me personally. So once again, the Roland JU06A fits this perfectly. It's fun to design sounds on, and it sounds really nice, and multi-sampling makes it better. Whereas the J6 is probably not a great candidate for this, at least not for my own personal purposes. Some people don't even like doing much sound design. Personally, I used to be really intimidated by it, and now I really enjoy it. So now I seek stuff out that's great for sound design. Another example is my beloved Arturia Micro Freak. It's a bit of a weird synth to work with, and sometimes doesn't always fit into a mix by default, but with a bit of processing, it can fit great into a mix. And what's more, because of all its sound engines, it's very fun to just explore. It's fun to just try stuff, send a bunch of stuff through crazy modulation sources and a bunch of oscillators all doing crazy stuff. It's a fun synth to design sounds on, and that's what I like it for. I like to design sounds on it, then harvest those sounds for later use, essentially. Now is a great time to mention that I sell a $5 pack of multi-sampled synth sounds, made with my Korg Minilog, my JU06A, and my Arturia Micro Freak. That's available at the link in the description. $5 helps keep the channel going. Thanks so much if you choose to get that. All the WAV files are also in there, so if you're not an MPC user, you can still get some use out of it, or you can use the free MPC Beats software to load in those key group programs as well. And finally, the fourth major way that immediately comes to mind for me for using hardware synths, and that is playing them as proper instruments. And by this I mean you're a keys player. You're going to be playing live as part of a band or solo. Regardless, you're playing keys live into a synthesizer. This is a category I very much do not fall into. I've played drums for 2 decades, hence the electronic kit I've got behind me, but I'm not much of a keys player. I know enough about playing piano to kind of come up with stuff, but as far as playing, I'm not great. Let's be real here. So I don't fall into this category, but if you're a musician who wants to properly play live, not sequenced, but actually, playing the keys, these are the things you want to probably look out for. For one thing, you probably are going to want a lot of voices. So maybe you're going digital rather than analog, because you also probably want a lot of versatility for a live setting. So something that is digital with a lot of options and a lot of voices is probably going to be the least frustrating to work with. That way you can get all the sounds you need quickly and with little friction and without having to lug a bunch of stuff around, and you'll be able to play pretty much whatever you want without bumping into any huge limitations. And I'm guessing this is one situation where it makes sense to maybe not go the super compact route, and it also probably makes sense to get something dedicated for this, and this is the one criteria you would need to fulfill to make a purchase justifiable. But a lot of synth nerds really aren't huge keyboard players from what I can tell, and are just decent keyboard players and care much more about the production in the studio aspect. So let me know if you fall into this category. I'd be interested to see how much of my audience falls into that category versus the kind of producer beatmaker category. But those are the main 4 ways that I personally could think of. If you've got any outliers or any major ones that I missed, please leave them in the comments below. And keep in mind my particular self-imposed rule of one synth must fulfill 2 other criteria. Another great example is the recently announced Volca FM2. That's a small synth great for jamming, but it's also very much meant for hands-on sound design. And of course, there are exceptions. Like I bought that really tiny synth that is mostly meant for hardware jamming as part of a larger setup, but let's be real here, there's a secret fifth category, which is exploiting weird gadgets for content. That being said, if you'd like to see some more related videos, you can click or tap up over here, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. Thank you so much for watching.